Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. In 1923, Glacier National Park was melting so quickly that experts predicted all the ice would be gone by 1948. This was reported by the Associated Press. The hot, dry seasons of the past few years have caused rapid disintegration of glaciers in Glacier National Park, Montana. Professor Waterman of Northwestern University declared in an address today before the geologic section of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Sperry Glacier, studied by Professor Waterman, has lost 1/4 or perhaps 1/3 of its ice in the past 18 years, he said. If this rapid retreat should continue, the professor added, the glacier would almost disappear in another 25 years. But he expressed the opinion that the long dry seasons of the past few years is over, with probabilities of a lessening in the retreat. And the following year, in 1924, Professor Elrod of the University of Montana predicted that the ice would be gone in a few years. He said the glaciers were melting away 15 to 30 feet each year, and within a few years will have disappeared entirely. It's almost 100 years later, and the glaciers are still there. The glacial retreat massively slowed sometime after 1924. We know from what Professor Waterman said that temperatures there must have been very warm from 1905 to 1923. But if we look at the official U.S. government temperature graph for Montana, they show the years from 1905 to 1923 as being among the coldest on record. So according to the U.S. government, glaciers retreat rapidly when it's very cold, and then when temperatures warm up, the glacial retreat slows down tremendously. What they're showing in this temperature graph makes no sense and is the inverse of reality. The reason why the NOAA temperature graph makes no sense is because they massively tamper with Montana's data to cool the past. During the very warm period from 1905 to 1923, when the glaciers were rapidly melting, NOAA tampers with measured temperature data to make the temperatures appear to be almost 2.5 degrees cooler than they actually were. And recent temperatures they artificially inflate by about 1 degree. So that's about 3.5 degrees of data tampering which NOAA is engaged in. Data tampering is how NOAA creates this obviously fraudulent temperature graph for Montana. And it's not just in Montana. In 1923, the New York Times reported that glaciers were melting very rapidly in the Arctic. The New York Times reported a radical change in climatic conditions in the Arctic and hitherto unheard of high temperatures. They said, many old landmarks are so changed as to be unrecognizable. Where formerly great masses of ice were found, there are now often moraines, accumulations of earth and stones. At many points where glaciers formerly extended far into the sea, they have entirely disappeared. The New York Times reported that the waters around Spitsbergen had warmed up 12 degrees Celsius. And it wasn't just in the Arctic. In 1921, the New York Times reported a worldwide heat wave of unusual length and intensity. The New York Herald reported death for millions in 1921's record heat wave. Millions of people in Europe, Russia, and Asia were starving because of the record heat and drought of 1921. The New York Times reported that 2 million Koreans were starving in Manchuria owing to drought-ruined crops. They also reported that drought killed fish in the River Seine, and France was suffering their most severe drought in 47 years. And at the same time, the Rhine and Moselle rivers were having their highest flood in 136 years. We know from the historical record that this period around 1920 was very warm, and that glaciers were rapidly melting in the Arctic and in Montana. We know that there was a worldwide heat wave in 1921 that was starving millions of people. Yet NASA shows these years as being the coldest on record. Now let's fast forward to the New York Times in 1970. U.S. and Soviet press studies of a colder Arctic. The United States and the Soviet Union are mounting large-scale investigations to determine why the Arctic climate is becoming more frigid, why parts of the Arctic sea ice have recently become ominously thicker, and whether the extent of that ice cover contributes to the onset of ice ages. So we know that around 1970 it was very cold and Arctic sea ice was becoming ominously thicker. Science News ran this cover in 1975. The Ice Age cometh, and they showed glaciers plowing through downtown Manhattan. Now let's look at the NASA temperature graph again. Here's 1970. They show it much warmer than 1921. In 1970, the Arctic was frigid, the ice was getting much thicker, and experts were worried about glaciers plowing through Manhattan. Yet NASA shows 1970 being much warmer than this period when there was a worldwide heat wave, people were starving to death, and glaciers were rapidly disappearing. This NASA temperature graph doesn't make any sense. They show ice growing when it's warmer and ice melting when it's colder. This graph from NASA is propaganda. It's not an accurate representation of Earth's temperature. Yet this fraudulent temperature graph from NASA forms the basis of much of climate science and much of government policy. Toto has been studying this for the past 13 years and pulling back the curtain on this fraud. You can visit him, Kyrie, and Caesar on the web at realclimatescience.com.